What if the man who built an entire empire on racial purity, who murdered millions in the name of blood, who proclaimed the supremacy of one group of people above all others, was himself descended from the very people he sought to destroy? What if the Führer's own genetic code, buried deep in the chromosomes carried by his living relatives, told a story so profoundly contradictory to everything he stood for that historians have struggled to fully process its implications? Adolf Hitler constructed the most murderous racial ideology the modern world has ever seen. He classified human beings by bloodline, decreed entire populations unworthy of existence, and systematically exterminated millions based on his theories of genetic purity and racial hierarchy. But when modern science turned its instruments toward the DNA of Hitler's own family, what it found shook the foundations of everything the Third Reich had stood for. In this video, we are going to go deep into the science, the history, the genealogical investigations, and the extraordinary discoveries that have emerged from decades of research into Adolf Hitler's ancestry. We will examine the groundbreaking DNA studies, the long-standing mysteries about his paternal grandfather, the shocking theories about possible Jewish ancestry, the Nazi regime's own frantic investigations into the Führer's bloodline, and the devastating irony of what modern genetic science has revealed. By the time we are done, you will understand not only what DNA revealed about Hitler's ancestry, but why that revelation carries such extraordinary historical and moral weight. So without further ado, let's start from the very beginning. To understand why the DNA findings were so shocking, we first need to understand the world Hitler created around the concept of racial identity. From the earliest days of the Nazi movement, Adolf Hitler was obsessed with the idea that human beings could be sorted into hierarchical categories based on their blood. His magnum opus, Mein Kampf, published in 1925, was soaked in this ideology. He wrote at length about the Aryan race, which he imagined as a tall, blonde, blue-eyed people of Northern European descent, superior in intellect, culture, and strength to all others. He described Jews as a parasitic race, alien to European civilization, biologically different in ways that made them dangerous and inferior. He described Slavic peoples as subhuman, fit only for servitude or extermination. He described Africans and Arabs in terms so degrading they are almost impossible to reproduce without feeling a deep moral revulsion. This ideology was not merely an abstract belief system for Hitler. He turned it into policy. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of German citizenship and banned marriage between Jews and non-Jews. The Nazi regime created elaborate bureaucratic systems to classify individuals by ancestry, demanding proof of Aryan heritage going back multiple generations. People who could not prove their racial purity faced discrimination, persecution, deportation, and ultimately death. An entire apparatus of genocide, the Holocaust, was constructed on the foundations of these racial theories. 6 million Jews were murdered. Millions of Romani people, disabled individuals, homosexuals, political prisoners, and others deemed racially or socially undesirable were systematically killed. And at the center of this ideology, directing it, inspiring it, demanding it, was Adolf Hitler, the man who claimed to embody the racial values he was imposing on the world. But here is the extraordinary thing. Adolf Hitler did not look like the Aryan ideal he celebrated. He was not tall, he was not blonde, he did not have blue eyes, he was a dark-haired, pale-skinned man of medium height with brown eyes. His own propagandists had to carefully manage his image to avoid the obvious contradiction between the man and the racial icon he claimed to represent. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, who was himself physically far from the Nordic ideal, once joked darkly that he and Hitler would have been the first to fail their own racial tests. But the physical appearance was only the beginning. The deeper contradictions lay buried in the genetic record, waiting for technology to catch up with history. And when it finally did, the results were, to put it mildly, remarkable. Would Hitler himself have passed the rigorous racial examination his regime applied to millions of others? The DNA evidence strongly suggests the answer is no. Let us begin at the very foundation of this mystery, because before we can discuss what DNA revealed, we need to understand the fundamental biographical puzzle that has haunted Hitler's family history for over a century. The question of who Adolf Hitler's paternal grandfather actually was has never been definitively answered. and this uncertainty forms the backdrop against which all subsequent genetic discoveries must be understood. Hitler's father was Alois Hitler, born on June 7, 1837, in the small Austrian village of Stronez. But when Alois was born, his name was not Hitler at all. His birth certificate recorded him as Alois Schicklgruber, the illegitimate son of a woman named Maria Schicklgruber. The father's name was left blank. This was not unusual for the time and place. Illegitimate births were common in rural Austria, and single mothers often could not or would not name the father, whether because he had abandoned them, because naming him would cause social complications, or for reasons that remain entirely unknown. What was unusual about Alois Schicklgruber's case was that the question of his paternity would eventually become one of the most intensely scrutinized genealogical puzzles in all of human history, simply because of who his son would turn out to be. Maria Schicklgruber was born in 1795 in Stronez, a tiny community in the Waldviertel region of Lower Austria. She was a peasant woman, poor and unremarkable by the historical standards of her day, who would never have attracted any attention at all had it not been for the child she brought into the world in 1837. When Alois was born, Maria was 42 years old, which was considered quite advanced for childbearing at the time. The father of her child was, as far as the official record was concerned, unknown. Maria raised young Alois for the first 5 years of his life before she died in 1847, leaving him an orphan. He was subsequently taken in and raised by a farmer named Johann Nepomuk Hitler, whose brother Johann Georg Hitler had at some point been in a relationship with, or possibly married to, Maria Schicklgruber. The exact nature of the relationship between Maria and these two brothers, Johann Georg Hitler and Johann Nepomuk Hitler, would later become the subject of extensive investigation and speculation. What matters for our story is what happened decades later in 1876, when a remarkable legal maneuver was executed that would change the course of history in ways nobody could possibly have anticipated at the time. In 1876, nearly 30 years after Maria Schicklgruber had died, and almost 40 years after Alois was born, an elderly Johann Georg Hitler appeared before a notary in the town of Weitra with 3 witnesses and declared that he was the father of Alois Schicklgruber. This posthumous acknowledgement of paternity was legally questionable from the start. Johann Georg had never acknowledged the child during Maria's lifetime or for the nearly 3 decades since her death. He waited until he was himself an old man, reportedly in poor health, before making this declaration. The witnesses to the declaration were all relatives of Johann Nepomuk Hitler, which struck some observers as suspicious. Nevertheless, the local priest, Father Zandschirm, accepted the declaration and amended the baptismal register, striking out the blank in the father's column and inserting the name Georg Hitler, a spelling variant of Hitler, and so in 1876, Alois Schicklgruber legally became Alois Hitler. 40 years later, his son Adolf Hitler would be born, and the question of whether Johann Georg Hitler truly was Alois's father, or whether some other man had fathered the child on Maria Schicklgruber in the winter of 1836 or spring of 1837, would remain unanswered. Why does this matter so profoundly? Because among the candidates for who might have fathered Alois Schicklgruber, one theory has proven both remarkably persistent and utterly explosive. The theory that Alois's father, and therefore Adolf Hitler's paternal grandfather, was Jewish. This theory has been disputed, debated, investigated and argued over for nearly a century, and its origins lie in a startling confession made by one of the most infamous men of the Third Reich itself. Hans Frank was Hitler's personal lawyer, the man who would later serve as Governor-General of occupied Poland and preside over the murder of millions of Jews in his territory. At the Nuremberg trials after the war, having been found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death, Frank wrote memoirs in his cell while awaiting execution. In those memoirs, he made an extraordinary claim. He wrote that he had been commissioned by Hitler himself early in the Nazi rise to power to investigate the Führer's family background because of threats by a blackmailer who claimed to have information about Hitler's ancestry. Frank said he travelled to the Waldviertel region and investigated the records, and what he claimed to have found was deeply troubling, at least from a Nazi ideological perspective. According to Frank's account, Maria Schicklgruber had been employed as a cook in the household of a Jewish family named Frankenberger in Graz, the capital of the Austrian province of Styria. Frank claimed that Maria had become pregnant while in service with this family, and that the father of her child was the 19-year-old son of the household, a young man named Johann Frankenberger. Frank further claimed that after Alois was born, the Frankenberger family had paid child support to Maria Schicklgruber for 14 years, and that correspondence between Maria and the Frankenberger family had survived and been found during the investigation. If true, this would mean that Adolf Hitler's paternal grandfather was a Jew, making Hitler himself partly Jewish by the very bloodline definitions his own regime used to condemn millions to death. The irony would be almost incomprehensible. The architect of the Holocaust, the man who more than anyone else in history had built an ideology on the hatred and persecution of Jewish people, might himself have been of Jewish descent. Frank's account spread widely after the war and became one of the most discussed and debated claims in all of Hitler scholarship. But was it true? The short answer, based on decades of subsequent historical research, is almost certainly not, at least not in the specific form Frank described it. Beginning in the 1950s and accelerating through the latter decades of the 20th century, serious historians began investigating Frank's claims systematically, and what they found was a series of fundamental problems with his account. The most damaging discovery was a simple matter of historical record. There were no Jews living in Graz in the 1830s. Austrian law at the time prohibited Jews from residing in Styria, the province of which Graz was the capital. The records have been searched thoroughly, and there is no family named Frankenberger in Graz's Jewish community records for the relevant period because there was no Jewish community in Graz during that period. The expulsion of Jews from Styria had occurred in the late 15th century, and they were not permitted to return until the 1860s, more than 2 decades after Alois Schicklgruber was born. There was simply no Frankenberger family for Maria to have. Worked for, no 19-year-old son to have fathered her child, and no child support payments to have been made. The historian Werner Masser, who conducted one of the most thorough investigations into Hitler's ancestry in the 1970s, concluded definitively that Hans Frank's account was fabricated, or at best was based on a complete misunderstanding or confusion of the historical evidence. But why would Frank have invented or embellished such a story? Several explanations have been proposed. Some historians believe Frank genuinely discovered something he misinterpreted, perhaps finding records of a different family or a different location that he conflated with the Graz story. Others believe Frank was engaging in a kind of posthumous revenge against Hitler, a man he had served with fanatical devotion and whose ideology had led Frank himself to commit the crimes for which he was being executed. By tainting Hitler's ancestry with Jewish blood, Frank could simultaneously wound Hitler's legacy and complicate any simple narrative about the evil of Nazi ideology by revealing the Führer's own hypocrisy at the most intimate genetic level. Still, others have suggested that Frank was simply mentally unstable by the time he wrote his memoirs, having faced the full weight of his own guilt and the horror of what the regime had done, and that his account mixed real fragments with fantasy. Whatever the explanation, the consensus among mainstream historians is that the specific Frankenberger story is not credible. However, and this is a crucial point, the debunking of the Frankenberger story doesn't mean that Hitler's paternal grandfather was definitely not Jewish, or that the question of Alois's paternity has been settled. It simply means that Frank's specific account cannot be trusted. The identity of Maria Schicklgruber's lover in the winter of 1836 remains to this day officially unknown. The man who later claimed paternity, Johann Georg Hitler, had ample reason to do so, for reasons that had nothing to do with actually being the father. By acknowledging Alois as his son in 1876, Hitler could ensure that the family's property and the social standing of the extended Hitler clan would remain connected to Alois, who had by that point built a reasonably successful career as a customs official. The acknowledgement may have been a matter of family convenience rather than biological truth. And some historians have pointed to Johann Nepomuk Hitler, who raised Alois after Maria died, as the more likely biological father, since it was his relatives who served as witnesses to the 1876 declaration, and it was he who appeared to take the most active interest in Alois's welfare throughout the boy's life. But the fundamental mystery remains: nobody knows with certainty who fathered Alois Schicklgruber in 1837. And because of that uncertainty, the door to alternative theories about Hitler's ancestry, including the theory of Jewish descent, has never been fully closed. This is where the story takes a dramatic turn, because in the early years of the 21st century, modern science offered a new tool for investigating these ancient questions. DNA analysis, which had revolutionized forensic science, medicine, and anthropology, could now be applied to questions of genealogy and ancestry in ways that were simply not possible for previous generations of researchers. And when scientists and journalists turned this technology toward the question of Adolf Hitler's ancestry, the results were extraordinary. The key investigation that brought this story to global attention was conducted in 2010 by a Belgian journalist named Jean-Paul Mulders, who worked in collaboration with a historian named Mark Vermeeren. Mulders, a writer with a background in investigative journalism and a particular interest in historical mysteries, had become fascinated by the question of Hitler's ancestry and decided to approach it through the lens of modern genetics. His method was both elegant and, from a scientific standpoint, entirely sound. Since Hitler himself was long dead and his body had been burned and the remains subsequently lost or destroyed, it was impossible to obtain DNA directly from the man himself. But genetics does not require the original subject. What Mulders needed were living relatives who could provide samples, and thanks to the peculiarities of how Y chromosome DNA is inherited, those relatives could provide meaningful information about the paternal lines stretching back generations. The Y chromosome is passed from father to son essentially unchanged, accumulating only very slow random mutations over time. This means that all males in a direct paternal line, no matter how many generations separate them, share essentially the same Y chromosome profile, what geneticists call a haplogroup. If Mulders could find living male relatives of Adolf Hitler who were descended from the same paternal line, their Y chromosomes would reflect the same haplogroup that Adolf Hitler himself carried, and that haplogroup could be compared to databases of global human genetic diversity to determine what ancient human populations it was associated with. The challenge was finding living relatives. Adolf Hitler himself had no known children, but his family tree extended in other directions. He had a half-brother, Alois Hitler Jr., whose descendants included a line of relatives living in the United States, most prominently a man named Alexander Stuart-Houston, who was the great-nephew of Adolf Hitler and lived in Long Island, New York. There were also relatives in Austria, descendants of the broader Hitler-Hiedler family network. Mulders managed to collect DNA samples from 39 individuals who could be identified as relatives of Adolf Hitler through the paternal line. He obtained saliva samples from these individuals and submitted them for Y chromosome analysis. The results were published in Knack magazine in Belgium in August 2010, and they caused a sensation. The Y chromosome haplogroup identified in Hitler's relatives was designated E1b1b. To understand why this was so shocking, it is necessary to understand what this haplogroup represents in the broader landscape of human genetic history. E1b1b, sometimes written as E-M35 in modern genetic nomenclature, is one of the major branches of the human Y chromosome phylogenetic tree. It is believed to have originated in East Africa, or the Horn of Africa, tens of thousands of years ago, and spread from there into North Africa and the Middle East, and eventually into parts of Europe. Today, it is most commonly found in North Africa, particularly among Berber populations in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. It is also found at relatively high frequencies among certain populations in the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, and the Eastern Mediterranean. And crucially, it is found at notably elevated frequencies among Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews, and other Jewish diaspora populations around the world. In Western and Central Europe, where the vast majority of Germans and Austrians have their genetic roots, E1b1b is relatively uncommon. The haplogroups most typical of Germanic and Central European populations are R1a, R1b, I1, and I2, all of which have their deepest roots in the prehistoric populations of Europe itself. E1b1b, by contrast, is a marker of an entirely different migration pattern, one that traces back to the ancient movements of people out of Africa and into the Mediterranean world and Middle East thousands of years before the Germanic tribes of Europe came into being. The implications were staggering. Adolf Hitler, the man who had proclaimed the supremacy of the Aryan race and the absolute biological inferiority of Jewish people and African peoples, apparently carried a Y chromosome haplogroup that was most closely associated with precisely those populations. His paternal genetic signature, the one passed from father to son in an unbroken line going back thousands of years, was far more common among Berbers and Jews than among the northern European peoples he had idealized. The geneticist Ronnie de Korte, who analysed the data for Mulders and Vermeeren, was careful to point out what the findings did and did not mean. Having E1B1B does not mean that Hitler was Jewish or North African. Haplogroups trace single ancestral lines over long periods of time and do not define a person's complete genetic makeup, which is a complex mixture of contributions from all their ancestors. A person with E1B1B on their Y chromosome might have the vast majority of their other ancestry from any population anywhere in the world. But the haplogroup does tell us something real and specific about the ancient origin of the paternal line. And in Hitler's case, that origin was emphatically not the Northern European, Nordic, Aryan line that Nazi ideology celebrated. The deep ancestral roots of Hitler's paternal lineage lay in Africa and the Mediterranean, not in the Germanic forests and plains that Nazi mythology had romantically constructed as the cradle of racial superiority. The story becomes even more complex when we consider what Mulders and Vermeeren discovered among Hitler's specific relatives who were sampled. The haplogroup E1B1B found in the relatives showed particular subcluster characteristics that aligned most closely with Berber populations from North Africa, and to a significant degree with Sephardic Jewish populations. The magazine Knack reported that the haplogroup was particularly common in groups such as Berbers, and also in Somalians, Moroccans, and, to a lesser extent, among Sephardic Jews. The article went on to note the profound irony that Hitler, in his racial mania, was one of the people he hated. The publication of these findings set off immediate debate in academic circles, in the media, and among the broader public interested in the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust. Some greeted the findings with a kind of grim satisfaction, seeing in them a fitting cosmic irony. Others pointed to the scientific limitations of the study. Some historians cautioned against over-interpreting the results, and geneticists debated the precise meaning of haplogroup analysis in the context of individual ancestry claims. Before we go further into the scientific and historical debate surrounding the DNA findings, let us take a step back and look more carefully at Hitler's maternal ancestry, because the story of his genetics is not only about the Y chromosome and the paternal line. His mother's family adds another layer of complexity and historical intrigue to the already remarkable story of his origins. Adolf Hitler's mother was Clara Pölzl, born on August 12, 1860, in the village of Spittel in the Waldviertel region of Lower Austria. Clara was, by all accounts, a quiet, deeply religious woman who adored her son Adolf with an intensity that many historians have seen as a formative influence on his development. She died of breast cancer in December 1907. When Adolf was just 18 years old, and her death left him devastated. Hitler reportedly carried a photograph of his mother with him throughout his life, and some psychological analyses of his behaviour have focused extensively on the impact of her death on his emotional development. But beyond the psychological dimensions, Clara Pölzl's family background adds a fascinating and troubling dimension to the question of Hitler's ancestry, because Clara was not a stranger to the Hitler family. She was a relative. Specifically, Clara Pölzl was the granddaughter of Johann Nepomuk Hitler, the same man who had raised Alois Schicklgruber after the death of his mother Maria. This meant that Alois Hitler and Clara Pölzl were second cousins of a sort, sharing a common ancestor in Johann Nepomuk Hitler. In the legal and religious framework of 19th century Catholic Austria, this degree of consanguinity was considered sufficiently close that a marriage between the two required a special dispensation from the Catholic Church. Alois and Clara applied for and received this dispensation, and they were married on January 7, 1885. Their marriage was complicated by the fact that at the time of their wedding, Alois was still technically married to his second wife, Franziska Matzelsberger, who was dying of tuberculosis. She died 6 months after Alois and Clara's marriage. The relationship between Alois and Clara had begun while Alois was still married, and Clara had served as a housekeeper in his household, caring for the children of his earlier relationships before their own children were born. Of the 6 children Alois and Clara had together, only 2 survived to adulthood: Adolf Hitler and his younger sister Paula, who lived until 1960. The consanguinity between Hitler's parents raises another dimension of the genetic story. When closely related, individuals have children together. There is an increased probability that the children will inherit identical copies of the same gene variants from both parents, a phenomenon known as homozygosity, which can sometimes increase the expression of recessive genetic traits. Some researchers have speculated that the relatively high rate of infant mortality among Alois and Clara's children, 4 of their 6 children died in infancy or early childhood, may have been partly related to the effects of this consanguinity. Whether or not this is the case, the family tree of Adolf Hitler was already remarkably entangled before his own life began, with the same small pool of Waldviertel peasant families appearing repeatedly across multiple generations. And this entanglement makes the genetic picture even more interesting, because when the DNA from living relatives was analysed, the researchers were looking at a gene pool that was itself the product of generations of relatively local endogamy in this small corner of rural Austria. Now let us look more carefully at what the genetic science actually tells us and what its limitations are, because this is a story where it is genuinely important to distinguish between what we know, what we can reasonably infer, and what remains genuinely uncertain. The 2010 Mulders-Vermeeren study was not conducted by academic geneticists in a peer-reviewed research context. It was an investigative journalism project, and while the DNA analysis was performed by qualified scientists, the study's design and methodology had characteristics that make its conclusions suggestive rather than definitively proven. The most significant limitation is the one we have already touched on. None of the DNA came from Adolf Hitler himself. All 39 samples came from individuals who were identified as relatives through genealogical research, and the accuracy of those genealogical identifications is itself subject to the same uncertainties that plague all. Research into Hitler's family background. If, for example, the paternal line of the American relatives was not actually descended from Hitler's paternal grandfather, but from some other male in the family tree through a case of what geneticists call non-paternity, then the Y chromosome results might not reflect Hitler's actual paternal haplogroup at all. A second limitation is that haplogroup analysis, while powerful as a tool for tracing deep ancestry and population-level patterns, cannot tell us with precision about any individual's specific recent ancestry. The fact that E1b1b is common among Berber and Jewish populations does not mean that the specific E1b1b lineage found in Hitler's relatives traces specifically to a Jewish or Berber ancestor in any historically recent period. The haplogroup could have entered the European gene pool many centuries or even millennia ago through any number of possible migration pathways long before the formation of modern Jewish communities or the ethnic groups that today characterize North Africa. Nevertheless, the presence of E1b1b in Hitler's family line is a genuinely significant finding, not because it proves that Hitler was Jewish or African, but because it proves that his paternal lineage did not originate among the northern European populations that Nazi racial ideology identified as the pure Aryan stock. His Y chromosome, by any reasonable genetic interpretation, traces ultimately to ancient populations from outside the European heartland that Nazism romanticized and claimed to represent. The reaction to the Mulders-Vermeeren study among professional historians was mixed. Some embraced the findings enthusiastically, seeing in them a powerful scientific confirmation of the irony that had long been suspected in Hitler's family background. Others were more cautious, noting the methodological limitations and warning against over-interpreting the results. Ian Kershaw, the British historian whose 2-volume biography of Hitler is widely considered the definitive scholarly account of the man and his legacy, was among those who expressed caution. Kershaw and others pointed out that haplogroup findings about distant relatives cannot be taken as definitive proof of any particular ancestral identity for Hitler himself, and that the danger of sensationalizing the results could distort rather than illuminate our understanding of this history. Robert Gellatley, another prominent Hitler scholar, echoed similar concerns while acknowledging that the findings were genuinely interesting from a genealogical perspective. The debate among historians has never been fully resolved, and it continues to this day whenever new genetic studies or genealogical investigations revisit the question of Hitler's ancestry. But the debate itself reveals something important about why these questions matter so much. The fascination with Hitler's ancestry is not merely a matter of historical curiosity, it goes to the heart of some of the most profound questions the 20th century raised about identity, race, and the nature of human categorization. If Hitler was partly of Jewish or African ancestry, what does that tell us about the categories he used to define and destroy millions of people? If the architect of racial purity was himself racially impure by his own definitions, does this mean that the categories were always meaningless? Or does it simply reveal the particular madness of one individual who may have been projecting his own anxieties about identity onto the world? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are questions that the DNA findings force us to confront in a new and urgent way. And to explore them fully, we need to go deeper into the specific details of what was discovered, how the Nazi regime itself tried to manage the question of Hitler's ancestry, and what the living relatives of Adolf Hitler have said and done in response to all of this. Let us turn now to one of the most remarkable aspects of this entire story. The fact that the Nazi regime itself, the government that demanded racial purity documentation from every German citizen, was acutely aware of and deeply troubled by the gaps and uncertainties in its own leader's family history. From the earliest days of the Nazi movement, political opponents had raised questions about Hitler's ancestry as a way of attacking him. The most damaging allegation was, of course, the claim of Jewish descent through Alois's unknown father. Hitler was reportedly furious at these allegations and took them extremely seriously, not, of course, because he believed they were true, but because he understood how politically damaging they could be in the context of the ideology he was promoting. In 1930, 2 years before the Nazi seizure of power, a political opponent named Hans Mend published pamphlets making claims about Hitler's Jewish ancestry. Hitler sued for libel, and the case was settled out of court with a payment to Hitler. But the allegations did not go away. It was in this context that, according to Hans Frank's account, Hitler commissioned Frank to investigate the family background in the Waldviertel. Frank's subsequent investigation, whatever its accuracy, demonstrated that Hitler was sufficiently concerned about the question of his ancestry to want answers. And after the Nazis came to power in 1933, the regime took active steps to manage the narrative around Hitler's family background. Official biographers were carefully briefed. Genealogical records in the Waldviertel that might have been embarrassing were reportedly suppressed or made inaccessible. The village of Döllersheim, near Ströns, where Maria Schicklgruber had been born and where she was buried, was deliberately razed to the ground. In 1938 and 1939, the Wehrmacht evacuated the village and its surrounding area and converted it into an artillery training range, destroying the village and the church records it contained. Historians have long debated whether the destruction of Döllersheim was deliberate to cover up records related to Hitler's ancestry, or whether it was simply a matter of military necessity. But the timing, coming just a year after the Anschluss that incorporated Austria into the Third Reich, has struck many observers as suspiciously convenient. What we know is that despite the regime's attempts to manage the narrative, the fundamental uncertainty about Hitler's paternal grandfather could never be fully resolved. The official Nazi biography of Hitler, prepared with meticulous attention to ideological requirements, traced his ancestry as far back as the records allowed, and the records showed exactly what the independent genealogical research has always shown, that the line went back to Alois Hitler, that Alois was officially acknowledged as the son of Johann Georg Hitler, and that beyond that point the records were ambiguous and incomplete. The Nazi regime's racial laws required German citizens to prove their Aryan ancestry back to 1750. Yet the family history of the Führer himself could not be clearly traced back even to 1837 without ambiguity. This was a profound irony that the regime's propagandists simply had to live with, papering over the gaps with official silence and ideological assertion. The figure who perhaps most embodied the regime's anxiety about Hitler's ancestry was Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of the architects of the Holocaust. Himmler, who was fanatically devoted to the ideology of racial purity, was reportedly told by his own genealogical researchers that Hitler's ancestry was insufficiently documented to meet the standards the regime imposed on ordinary Germans. According to some accounts, Himmler was deeply troubled by this, but lacked any practical way to address the problem without undermining the Führer's authority. The SS Ahnenerbe, the pseudo-scientific research organization that Himmler had established to investigate the ancestral heritage of the Germanic peoples, was reportedly used to investigate Hitler's family background as part of its broader genealogical work. But any findings that were uncomfortable were presumably buried rather than published. The entire episode illustrates the profound intellectual and moral bankruptcy of Nazi racial ideology. An ideology that claimed scientific rigor but was in fact built on fantasy, projection, and willful ignorance, enforced by terror and bureaucratic violence. Let us now look more carefully at the specific subclade of E1b1b identified in Hitler's relatives, because the details matter enormously in understanding what the genetic evidence actually tells us. When geneticists analyze Y chromosome haplogroups, they do not simply identify the broad haplogroup designation, they also look at specific mutation patterns within the haplogroup that can help distinguish between different population-level origins. The E1b1b haplogroup is divided into several subclades, the most important of which for our purposes are E-Phi13, which is the most common form in Europe and is found particularly in the Balkans, the Aegean region, and parts of southern Europe, and EM81, which is overwhelmingly concentrated in North Africa and is the dominant Y chromosome haplogroup among Berber populations. The subclade identified in the Mulders-Vermeeren study has been described in various media reports as being particularly close to the North African EM81 form, though the published details of the analysis are not sufficiently granular to make a definitive subclade assignment based on the publicly available information. What the researchers did say quite explicitly was that the haplogroup found in Hitler's relatives was not the typical Germanic or Central European type. This finding aligned with the broader pattern that historical and genealogical research had suggested, that whatever else Adolf Hitler may have been, his deepest paternal ancestry was not. Rooted in the Northern European gene pool that Nazi ideology had elevated to a position of supreme racial importance. The irony is so profound that it has sometimes been described in almost literary terms. Hitler's Germany classified its citizens into racial categories with brutal efficiency, demanding documentation of Aryan ancestry, stripping people of citizenship based on grandparental identity, and ultimately murdering millions whose only crime was the accident of their birth. The man who created this system apparently carried a Y chromosome that, by the standards of any objective population genetic analysis, would have aligned him more closely with the populations he was persecuting than with the Aryan Nordic ideal he celebrated. It is a historical irony of almost unimaginable magnitude. But we should be careful not to let the irony overwhelm the nuance. The DNA findings are not a simple story of Hitler was Jewish or Hitler was African. Human ancestry is vastly more complex than any single genetic marker, and a Y chromosome haplogroup is only one small thread in the enormously complicated tapestry of a person's complete genetic heritage. Adolf Hitler had approximately 32 great-great-grandparents, and his DNA reflected contributions from all of them in varying proportions. The Y chromosome tells us about one of those 32 ancestral lines, the one that passed from father to father to father in an unbroken male chain. The other 31 lines are simply not captured by Y chromosome analysis. Hitler's total genetic makeup was almost certainly predominantly European in origin, simply because his family had lived in Central Europe for as many generations as records allowed to trace. The deep ancient origin of one paternal lineage in Africa and the Middle East does not change the fact that, in recent historical terms, his family was Central European, and his cultural identity was thoroughly Austrian and German. What the genetics tell us is not that Hitler was something other than what he appeared to be in recent historical terms, but that the categories he used to define racial identity were themselves deeply arbitrary and scientifically unfounded. If even the Führer's Y chromosome cannot be confined within the racial categories Nazi ideology proclaimed as absolute, that is a powerful testament to the fundamental absurdity of those categories in the first place. Well, that brings us to the end of Phase 1 of our exploration. But there is so much more to cover because the DNA story is only one part of a much larger investigation into what Hitler's ancestry reveals about the man, his ideology, and the world he tried to create. Coming up, we will look at the reactions of Hitler's living relatives to all of this, the extraordinary measures some of them have taken in response to the burden of carrying his name, the continuing academic debate about the precise meaning of the genetic findings, and much more. Stay with us. To truly understand the full weight of what the genetic discoveries about Hitler's ancestry mean, we need to look at the people who carry that ancestry forward into the present day, the living relatives of Adolf Hitler. Because while Hitler himself died in the Berlin bunker in April 1945, leaving no children or direct descendants, the family tree extended in other directions, and those branches are still alive today. The story of Hitler's living relatives is one of the most extraordinary subplots in the entire narrative of his family history, a story of people condemned by accident of birth to carry one of the most hated names in human history, and of the remarkable, varied, and sometimes devastating ways they have responded to that burden. Adolf Hitler had one full sister who survived to adulthood, Paula Hitler, born in 1896. Paula lived a quiet and relatively obscure life after the war, working in Vienna under an assumed name and deliberately distancing herself from her brother's legacy. She reportedly remained protective of Hitler's memory to some degree, describing him in interviews as a good brother, but she made no effort to capitalize on the connection and died in relative obscurity in Berchtesgaden in 1960. Since Paula had no children, that particular branch of the family ended with her. Hitler's half-brother, Alois Hitler Jr., was the son of Alois Hitler from his second wife, Franziska Matzelsberger. Alois Jr. had a complicated and difficult life, spending time in prison for theft and bigamy, and he died in Hamburg in 1956. But Alois Jr. had a son named William Patrick Hitler, born in 1911 in Liverpool, England, from his brief marriage to an Irish woman named Bridget Dowling. William Patrick Hitler had an extraordinary and bizarre life story that brought him directly into contact with Adolf Hitler at several crucial moments, and that eventually led him and his descendants to America. William Patrick's story deserves extended treatment because it illustrates so perfectly the strange and terrible position of being related to one of history's greatest monsters. Born in Liverpool, William Patrick grew up in England and was essentially estranged from his father, Alois Jr., who had abandoned the family. As a young man, William Patrick made several visits to Germany in the early 1930s as his uncle Adolf was rising to power, and he attempted to leverage his family connection to secure employment and financial advantages from the Nazi regime. These attempts were largely unsuccessful and deeply uncomfortable for all concerned. Adolf Hitler was reportedly embarrassed by his nephew and regarded him with a mixture of contempt and concern, seeing him as a potential source of scandal rather than an asset. William Patrick, for his part, reportedly tried to threaten Hitler with public revelations about the family's past, a form of blackmail that infuriated the Führer. The relationship between uncle and nephew was toxic from almost the beginning. By 1938, as the Nazi regime was becoming increasingly aggressive and threatening, William Patrick had had enough and left Germany for good. He travelled to Britain and then, in 1939, to the United States, where he embarked on an extraordinary career as a public speaker and essayist, writing about his experiences as Hitler's nephew. He published articles in magazines, gave lectures, and in 1939 wrote a piece for Look magazine under the headline "Why I Hate My Uncle," which laid out in searing terms his own experience of the Nazi regime and his condemnation of his uncle's ideology and actions. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, William Patrick attempted to enlist in the United States military and was initially rejected, apparently because the authorities were uncertain what to do with a man who was the nephew of the enemy's leader. He eventually petitioned President Franklin Roosevelt directly, and Roosevelt, reportedly with some amusement, instructed the Navy to allow him to enlist. William Patrick Hitler served in the United States Navy as a pharmacist's mate, and he was wounded in action. After the war, William Patrick Hitler made a remarkable decision that speaks volumes about his desire to escape the shadow of his uncle's name. He moved to Long Island, New York, changed his surname to Stuart-Houston, reportedly a combination of his mother's maiden name and an anglicization of his family background, and essentially disappeared into ordinary American life. He married a German-born woman named Phyllis Jean-Jacques in 1947, and together they had 4 sons. This is where the story connects directly to the DNA investigation because it was descendants of William Patrick's sons, including his great-nephew Alexander Stuart-Houston, who provided some of the DNA samples for the Mulders-Vermeeren study. The Stuart-Houston brothers, who include Brian, Louis, Alexander, and Howard, have reportedly made a quiet but deliberate pact to carry one of the most unusual burdens imaginable. They have collectively decided not to have children of their own, in an effort to allow the Hitler bloodline to die out naturally. They have not spoken extensively about this decision publicly, but it has been reported in various media accounts, and it represents a remarkable and somber response to the accident of their birth. These are men who did not choose their ancestry, who have lived quiet and law-abiding lives, who carry no responsibility for the crimes of their famous ancestor, and yet who have made the extraordinary choice to end the bloodline out of what appears to be a combination of personal reluctance and a kind of moral statement about the man their family descends from. The Austrian relatives of Hitler present a different picture. In the Waldviertel region where Hitler's family originated, there are still people who bear variants of the family name and who are connected to the broader extended family network of the Hitler clan. Some of these relatives have spoken to researchers and journalists over the years, and their accounts offer a fascinatingly complex picture of how a community deals with the knowledge that one of history's greatest monsters came from their midst. Some relatives have changed their names. Others have continued to live quietly in the region, generally declining to discuss their connection to Hitler. The village of Braunau am Inn, where Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, has had a complex relationship with its most notorious native son. For decades, a stone plaque outside his birthplace read, in German, "For peace, freedom and democracy, never again. Fascism, millions of dead, are a warning." The building itself has passed through various uses and ownership, including service as a school for children with disabilities and a bank, with the Austrian government purchasing it in 2016, and subsequently deciding to demolish the interior while preserving the exterior facade for conversion into a police station, partly to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis. The question of how to deal with the physical and historical remnants of Hitler's origins is one that communities in Austria and Germany have wrestled with for decades, and it connects directly to the broader question that the DNA findings raise. How do we understand a man whose own genetic heritage contradicted everything he stood for? One answer that some historians have proposed is that the contradictions in Hitler's ancestry are not merely an interesting irony, but actually illuminate something important about the psychology of the man himself. Several psychological and biographical analyses of Hitler have suggested that he may have had conscious or unconscious anxieties about his own origins that contributed to the ferocity of his anti-Semitism and his obsession with racial purity. The theory, advanced most prominently by the psychoanalyst Walter Langer in a wartime report commissioned by the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA, is that Hitler's violent anti-Semitism may have been partly fueled by a pathological fear that he himself was of Jewish descent. Under this theory, the Holocaust was not simply the expression of a coherent racial ideology, but was also, at some deep psychological level, an attempt by Hitler to destroy in others what he feared might exist in himself. This theory has always been controversial. Many historians reject it as speculative and unfalsifiable, arguing that we cannot and should not try to psychoanalyze historical figures on the basis of their actions alone, and that doing so risks reducing the Holocaust to a product of one man's personal psychology rather than the complex social, political, and cultural forces that actually produced it. Others find the psychological interpretation at least plausible as one element among many in explaining Hitler's particular brand of fanaticism. The historian Brigitte Hamann, who wrote an authoritative study of Hitler's years in Vienna, noted that the young Hitler encountered anti-Semitism in the context of a city where Jewish culture, intellect, and business success were highly visible and deeply resented by many impoverished German nationalists. Whether or not Hitler had personal anxieties about his own ancestry, he was swimming in an ocean of cultural anti-Semitism that would have shaped his worldview profoundly, regardless of his genetic background. What we can say with more confidence is that Hitler was acutely, almost obsessively aware of the question of his family background throughout his life. The fact that he commissioned Hans Frank to investigate the family history, the fact that the regime attempted to manage genealogical records in the Waldviertel, the fact that the village of Döllersheim was destroyed, all of these things suggest a man who was deeply uncomfortable with the gaps and uncertainties in his own ancestry. And the DNA findings give those anxieties a retrospective irony that is almost unbearable in its completeness. The man who had millions of people killed because they could not prove their racial purity apparently could not have proven his own. Let us now turn to another fascinating dimension of this story: the broader scientific debate about what haplogroup analysis can and cannot tell us about individual ancestry, and why this debate matters for how we interpret the findings about Hitler's relatives. When the Mulders-Vermeeren study was published in 2010, it attracted significant attention from geneticists, some of whom were enthusiastic about the findings, and others of whom raised important methodological concerns. One of the most significant concerns was about sample size and lineage verification. The study collected DNA from 39 individuals identified as relatives of Hitler, but the genetic analysis focused on the Y chromosome, which traces only the direct paternal line. Among those 39 individuals, how many were actually in the direct paternal line from Alois Hitler? And how confident could researchers be that the genealogical connections they had established were accurate? In a family history as complex and poorly documented as Hitler's, with illegitimate births, uncertain paternity, and deliberate obscuring of records, these questions are genuinely difficult to answer. Population geneticist Spencer Wells, who was the founding director of the Genographic Project, a major international effort to trace human migration through DNA analysis, commented on the Hitler haplogroup findings in various media interviews. Wells noted that E1b1b is indeed an unusual haplogroup to find in a Central European family with apparent roots in the Germanic-speaking peasant community of rural Austria, but he cautioned against drawing overly specific conclusions about Jewish or North African ancestry from the haplogroup designation alone. E1b1b entered Europe through multiple migration pathways at various points in prehistory, he pointed out, and its presence in a European family does not necessarily indicate any recent connection to Jewish or North African populations. The haplogroup could have entered the family line through any number of historical migration events that took place long before the formation of modern ethnic and religious communities. Nevertheless, Wells acknowledged that the finding was genuinely surprising and represented a meaningful piece of data in understanding Hitler's deep ancestry. The conversation that the findings opened up about the relationship between genetic ancestry and racial identity was, he suggested, valuable regardless of the specific conclusions one drew from the haplogroup data. The broader scientific context is also important here. By 2010, genetic research into human ancestry had already thoroughly demolished the concept of biological race as meaningful scientific category. The human genome project completed in 2003 had demonstrated that all human beings share approximately 99.9% of their DNA, and that the genetic variation between any two randomly selected humans is remarkable for how small it is. More specifically, the research had shown that the genetic differences between populations that we typically describe in racial terms are actually smaller than the genetic differences that exist within those populations. A randomly selected German and a randomly selected West African might share more genetic variants in common than two randomly selected Germans share with each other. The concept of race as a biological reality, as opposed to a social construction, has no meaningful foundation in modern genetics. This was, of course, the precise foundation on which Nazi ideology was built, and the foundation that genetics has shown to be entirely without scientific merit. In this context, the finding that Hitler's Y chromosome bore a haplogroup associated with non-European populations is not just an interesting irony about one individual. It is a microcosm of the larger truth that human genetic heritage does not respect the boundaries that racial ideologies attempt to impose on it. The flows of human migration, interbreeding, and genetic exchange over tens of thousands of years have created a picture of human genetic diversity that is far too complex, far too fluid, and far too interconnected to be reduced to the kind of rigid racial categories that Adolf Hitler used to define and destroy millions of people. The German and the Jew, the Aryan and the Semite, the European and the Africans are, in genetic terms, members of a single extraordinarily closely related species whose differences are far smaller than their similarities and whose ancestral histories are intertwined in ways that no racial ideology can contain or fully account for. Now, let us look at some of the other scientific and genealogical investigations that have contributed to our understanding of Hitler's ancestry over the years, because the Mulders-Vermeeren study was not the first or the only such effort, and placing it in context helps us understand both what we know and what remains uncertain. One of the earliest and most systematic genealogical investigations into Hitler's family was conducted by the Austrian archivist and historian Rudolf Koppensteiner, who published his findings in 1937. Koppensteiner's work was an official Nazi-era genealogical study, and its conclusions were therefore shaped by the ideological requirements of the regime. It traced Hitler's ancestry as far back as the records allowed and concluded, unsurprisingly, that there was no evidence of non-Aryan ancestry. But the study was constrained by exactly the same evidentiary gaps that all subsequent researchers have encountered. The unknown father of Alois Hitler could not be identified from the available records, and Koppensteiner's treatment of this central uncertainty was diplomatically vague. After the war, the genealogical investigation continued with more scholarly rigor. Werner Maser, whose comprehensive biography of Hitler published in 1971 included extensive genealogical research, concluded that the most likely candidate for Alois's biological father was Johann Nepomuk Hitler, rather than Johann Georg Hitler, based on circumstantial evidence, including the fact that Hitler raised Alois, that Hitler's relatives served as witnesses to the 1876 paternity declaration, and that Hitler and Maria Schicklgruber may have had a closer relationship than the historical record officially acknowledges. Maser was also among the most thorough debunkers of the Frankenberger theory, demonstrating systematically that the story could not be reconciled with the historical record. More recently, the Austrian genealogist Brigitte Hamann and others have continued to explore the question with modern research tools, including access to church records and civil registration documents that were not available to earlier researchers. The picture that emerges from all of this work is one of fundamental uncertainty at the crucial point. We simply do not know with certainty who fathered Alois Schicklgruber, and we probably never will, barring the discovery of some previously unknown document that settles the question definitively. Against this background of genealogical uncertainty, the DNA findings from 2010 offer something genuinely new. Not a resolution of the question of Alois's paternity, but a different kind of data that speaks to the deeper biological history of the paternal line, whatever its specific origin. The E1b1b haplogroup found in Hitler's relatives tells us something about where that paternal line ultimately traces back to in deep human history, regardless of whether the most recent unknown father was a man named Frankenberger, or a farmer named Hitler or Heidler, or someone else entirely unknown. Whatever. Specific man fathered Alois Schicklgruber in 1836 or 1837, that man's paternal ancestry apparently traced back to the ancient human populations that had migrated out of Africa and into North Africa and the Middle East, and from there into Europe, carrying the E1b1b genetic signature with them. This was the profound discovery that the 2010 study made possible, and it is a discovery that stands regardless of the uncertainties about the immediate paternity question. Let us now spend some time examining what we know about the specific characteristics and distribution of the E1b1b haplogroup in more detail, because understanding the science more fully helps us appreciate both the significance and the limitations of the Hitler ancestry findings. The E1b1b haplogroup is a member of the larger E haplogroup family, which is believed to have originated in East Africa somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, making it one of the older major branches of the human Y chromosome tree. The E haplogroup as a whole is strongly associated with African populations, and most of its major sub-branches are found primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. E1b1b is the branch of E that made it out of Africa and into the broader world, spreading through North Africa, the Horn of Africa, the Levant, and the Middle East, before eventually entering Europe through several different pathways. The two main subclades of E1b1b that are relevant for understanding its presence in Europe are E-Phi13 and E-M81. E-Phi-13 is believed to have expanded into Europe during the Neolithic period, roughly 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, carried by early farming populations that spread from Anatolia into the Balkans and then northward and westward across the continent. Today, E-513 is found at its highest frequencies in the Balkans, Greece and surrounding regions, but it has spread throughout Europe as a result of these ancient migrations and is found at lower but detectable frequencies across the continent, including in Central Europe. EM81, on the other hand, has remained far more geographically restricted and is found overwhelmingly in northwest Africa, particularly among Berber populations in Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia. It is one of the defining genetic markers of Berber ethnicity and is found at relatively low frequencies outside of North Africa. When EM81 is found in European populations, it is often attributed to more recent migration events, including the Moorish presence in the Iberian Peninsula during the medieval period and subsequent movements of North African-descended populations into southern Europe. The question of which subclade of E1b1b was found in Hitler's relatives is crucial for interpreting the findings, and unfortunately, the publicly available information from the Mulders-Vermeeren study does not allow for a definitive answer. The media reports about the study variously describe the haplogroup as being associated with North Africans, Jews, Berbers and Somalis, which is a description that better fits the broader E1b1b designation than any specific subclade. If the subclade were E-13, it would suggest a Neolithic European origin for that ancestral line, which would be less remarkable in terms of its implications for Hitler's identity. If the subclade were something closer to EM81, it would suggest a more recent connection to North African populations, which would be far more striking. The reports from Knack magazine and other outlets that covered the story suggested that the haplogroup found in Hitler's relatives was relatively unusual in Central European populations generally, which would be more consistent with a North African adjacent subclade than with the more commonly found European variants of E1b1b. But without full publication of the specific genetic data in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, it is impossible to be certain. What we can say with confidence is that even E-513, the most European-associated form of E1b1b, traces its ultimate origins to ancient populations that migrated into Europe from outside, from the Near East and through the Balkans, rather than from the indigenous Paleolithic hunter-gatherer populations of northern Europe that Nazi racial mythology celebrated as the ancestral Aryans. In this sense, even the most conservative interpretation of the haplogroup findings represents a genetic lineage that does not originate among the populations Hitler idealized. The ancient farmers who carried E-13 into Europe during the Neolithic were not Germanic Aryans. They were migrants from Anatolia, people whose ancestors had lived in what is now Turkey, and who spread into Europe, bringing agriculture with them thousands of years before any of the ethnic groups that Nazi ideology recognized as meaningful categories came into existence. The very categories that Hitler used to organize humanity were anachronistic even on his own terms, projecting modern ethnic identities back onto a prehistoric past in which no such identities existed. This brings us to another fascinating aspect of the Hitler ancestry story: the way in which it illuminates the fundamental incoherence of Nazi racial ideology from a scientific perspective. The Nazi Ahnenerbe, Himmler's pseudo-scientific research institute, spent years and enormous resources trying to demonstrate the existence of an ancient Aryan race with distinctive biological characteristics that set it apart from and above other human populations. Researchers were sent to Tibet, to Sweden, to South America to measure skulls and collect folk traditions and search for archaeological evidence of Aryan migration and superiority. The entire enterprise was, from the perspective of modern genetics and physical anthropology, complete fantasy. The concept of an Aryan race, as conceived by Nazi ideology, has no meaningful scientific basis. The Indo-European language family, which is sometimes confused with the concept of an Aryan racial group, describes a family of languages that spread across Eurasia through a combination of migration and cultural diffusion roughly 5,000 years ago. The speakers of these languages were indeed a distinct population group at one point, associated with the Yamnaya culture of the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea. But they were simply one human population among many, not a master race, and the mixing of their descendants with other populations over the subsequent millennia has thoroughly distributed their genetic signature across enormous geographic areas that include populations as diverse as Iranians, Indians, Greeks, Germans, Scandinavians, and many others. There is a profound irony in the fact that the Ahnenerbe's researchers, had they been doing actual science rather than ideologically motivated pseudo-science, would have discovered precisely what modern genetics has shown, that the human populations of Europe are a complex mixture of at least three major ancient groups: the indigenous Paleolithic hunter-gatherers who lived there before agriculture, the Neolithic farmers who came from Anatolia and carried haplogroups like EV13, and the later Bronze Age steppe migrants who brought Indo-European languages and carried haplogroups like R1a and R1b. None of these ancient groups was an Aryan master race. They were simply human populations doing what human populations have always done: migrating, mixing, adapting, and changing over time. The genetic heritage of any modern European, including Adolf Hitler, reflects this complex mixing of ancient populations, and the idea that any one thread in that tapestry represents racial purity or superiority is, as modern genetics makes absolutely clear, nothing but a dangerous fantasy. Let us now look at some specific additional genealogical findings that have emerged over the years in connection with Hitler's ancestry, because beyond the haplogroup study, there have been other interesting discoveries. One of the more intriguing is the question of what, if any, Slavic ancestry Hitler may have had through the maternal and paternal lines that are better documented. The Waldviertel region of Lower Austria, where Hitler's family originated on both the paternal and maternal sides, is and was an area of significant cultural and linguistic mixing between German-speaking and Czech-speaking populations. The border between Austria and Bohemia ran through this region, and Czech and German communities had coexisted and intermarried in the area for centuries. The specific villages where the Schicklgruber and Pölzl families lived were in a predominantly German-speaking area, but the surrounding region had substantial Czech-speaking communities, and the surnames of some individuals in the broader family network suggest possible Slavic origins. Some historians have pointed out that the surname Schicklgruber itself may have Slavic linguistic roots derived from Czech or Slovak naming conventions, though this etymology is debated. The surname Hitler or Heidler is typically of German origin, meaning something like one who lives in a hut or cottage. If Hitler had any Slavic ancestry, the irony would be compounding upon itself remarkably. His racial ideology classified Slavic peoples, including Czechs, Poles, Russians and others, as Untermenschen, subhumans fit only for enslavement or elimination. His plans for the conquered territories of Eastern Europe involved the enslavement or expulsion of the Slavic populations, the settlement of German colonists in their place, and the deliberate reduction of the surviving Slavic population through starvation and forced labor. The possibility that he himself had Slavic ancestry in his family tree is another layer of the same fundamental irony that the E1b1b haplogroup finding represents. The man who constructed a hierarchy of races apparently sat much lower in his own hierarchy than he recognized or acknowledged. The documentary evidence for specific Slavic ancestry is not as strong as the genetic evidence for a non-Germanic Y chromosome haplogroup, but the cultural and geographic context makes the possibility entirely plausible. Another genealogical curiosity that has attracted scholarly attention is the question of inbreeding in Hitler's family line and its possible genetic consequences. We have already mentioned that Hitler's parents, Alois and Clara, were second cousins, sharing Johann Nepomuk Hitler as a great-grandparent. But the pattern of consanguinity in the broader family network may have extended further back. In the small, isolated communities of the Waldviertel, where families were often related to their neighbours through multiple pathways over generations, a degree of genetic relatedness above the European average would not have been surprising. Some researchers have suggested that this background level of consanguinity may have contributed to the relatively high infant mortality rate among the children of Alois and Clara, who lost 4 of their 6 children at very young ages. The specific causes of death of the children who died in infancy are not always known, but the pattern is consistent with the kind of increased health vulnerability that can result from elevated homozygosity, the inheritance of identical gene variants from both parents as a result of their genetic relatedness. Whether these health effects extended to Adolf Hitler himself in any meaningful way is difficult to say. Hitler was known to have a number of health problems throughout his life, including gastrointestinal difficulties that caused him persistent distress, possible monarchism, which is the medical condition of having only one testicle, and the neurological symptoms that became increasingly prominent in the later years of his life, including the tremor in his left hand that was apparent in films from the last years of the war. Some of these health issues have been attributed to various causes, including the effects of the medications prescribed by his personal physician Theodor Morell, the trauma of the gas attack he suffered near Ypres in 1918, and various other factors. Whether any of them were connected to the genetic consequences of consanguinity in his family line is simply impossible to determine with the evidence available. But the question itself is interesting because it adds yet another layer to the extraordinary complexity of the genetic story. Let us now examine what happened in the years after the Mulder-Vermeeren study was published, because the scientific and historical conversation about Hitler's DNA did not end in 2010. As genetic technology continued to advance rapidly in the following decade, new tools became available that could potentially provide more precise information about ancestry and population origins. Next-generation sequencing, which allows the analysis of much larger portions of the genome than were possible with earlier. Y chromosome analysis alone became increasingly affordable and accessible throughout the 2000s and 10s. Consumer genetic testing services like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA became widely used, and the scientific community's understanding of ancient human DNA expanded dramatically as researchers successfully extracted and analyzed genetic material from archaeological specimens thousands of years old. In this context, several researchers and journalists revisited the question of Hitler's genetic ancestry with renewed interest. The basic finding of the 2010 study, the presence of an unusual Y chromosome haplogroup in Hitler's paternal relatives, was not overturned by any subsequent investigation. No new study has emerged that contradicts the E1b1b finding, and the ongoing refinement of genetic databases and haplogroup classifications has continued to confirm that E1b1b is unusual in Central European populations and more common in the populations of North Africa, the Middle East, and among Jewish diaspora communities. What changed in the years after 2010 was less the basic finding itself than the broader scientific and public understanding of what such findings mean. One significant development was the application of ancient DNA research to the question of European population origins. Beginning around 2012 and accelerating dramatically through the following decade, researchers extracted DNA from hundreds and then thousands of ancient human specimens from archaeological sites across Europe and analyzed it using modern genomic techniques. The picture that emerged confirmed and dramatically expanded what population geneticists had already suspected: that modern Europeans are descended from at least three distinct ancient populations: the indigenous Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, the Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, and the Bronze Age steppe migrants. This research, published in landmark papers in Nature and Science by researchers including David Reich at Harvard and Johannes Kraus at the Max Planck Institute, showed in fine genetic detail how these ancient populations mixed and merged over thousands of years to produce the genetic landscape of modern Europe. The haplogroup E1b1b, in its E-513 variant, was shown to be particularly associated with the Neolithic farmers who spread into Europe from Anatolia beginning around 8,000 years ago. In some interpretations, this actually makes E1b1b one of the oldest haplogroups in the European gene pool, having been present in Europe for as long as, or longer than, the steppe-associated haplogroups that are more common in modern Northern Europeans. This is a fascinating twist in the story. If Hitler's E1b1b haplogroup belongs to the E-513 subclade, then it could be argued, with some genealogical creativity, that his paternal line actually traces back to some of the first farmers who brought agriculture to Europe, people who were, in a sense, among the founders of European civilization. These ancient Anatolian farmers were not the Germanic Aryans of Nazi mythology, of course, but they were Europeans in every meaningful historical sense, having lived in Europe for thousands of years before any of the ethnic groups that appear in recorded history came into existence. Under this interpretation, Hitler's paternal lineage might be seen as ancient European in origin, just not the specific variety of ancient European that his ideology celebrated. But this interpretation requires that the E1b1b found in Hitler's relatives belongs to E-513, rather than a more North African-associated subclade. And as we have noted, the available published information does not allow us to make that determination definitively. What all of this scientific context does is demonstrate that the question of what DNA reveals about Hitler's ancestry is genuinely complex, layered, and fascinating, and that the popular media treatment of the story, which often reduced it to a simple headline of "Hitler was Jewish" or "North African," significantly understates that complexity. The truth is both more nuanced and, in some ways, more profound. What the genetics tells us is not that Hitler belonged to some specific modern ethnic or religious group, but that his genetic heritage, like that of every human being, was the product of thousands of years of migration, mixing, and change, and that no simple racial category can contain or describe it. The categories themselves were always the problem, not the genetic reality they purported to describe. Now we need to look carefully at one more crucial dimension of this story: the systematic investigation that modern science has enabled into the ancestry of other Nazi leaders, because Hitler was not the only figure in the Third Reich whose genetic ancestry might have presented uncomfortable contradictions with the ideology they enforced. While full genetic studies of the kind conducted on Hitler's relatives have not been performed on other Nazi families, the genealogical research that has been done on various leading figures of the regime has revealed some remarkable findings. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and the man most directly responsible for the operational machinery of the Holocaust, was deeply invested in the concept of racial purity. He had the SS create elaborate racial classifications, demand genealogical documentation from its members, and develop pseudo-scientific theories about the physical characteristics of the Nordic race. Yet Himmler himself was, by any reasonable physical assessment, far from the Nordic ideal. Short, bespectacled, with a weak chin and a rather unprepossessing physical appearance, Himmler's own physical characteristics were the opposite of the blonde, blue-eyed, tall Nordic warrior he celebrated. Himmler's genealogical background, as far as it has been investigated, shows roots in the same kind of Central European peasant and lower middle-class milieu as Hitler's own family. There is no evidence of Jewish ancestry in Himmler's documented family tree, but neither is there any obvious evidence of the Nordic blood that his ideology idealized. The same is true of many other leading figures of the Third Reich. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, was famously not tall, blonde, and blue-eyed. He was a short, dark-haired man with a club foot who had to use the power of language and propaganda to build the image of racial superiority he promoted. Hermann Göring, the Reich's second-in-command and head of the Luftwaffe, was obese, flamboyant, and self-indulgent in ways that made a mockery of the disciplined Aryan warrior image the regime projected. The disconnect between the physical reality of the Nazi leadership and the racial ideal they proclaimed was so obvious that it was noted and satirized even at the time by their opponents. Charlie Chaplin's brilliant 1940 film, The Great Dictator, captured this contradiction with devastating comic precision, casting Chaplin, who was himself rumoured to be of partial Jewish ancestry, in the dual role of a Jewish barber and a Hitler-like dictator. The case of Reinhard Heydrich, who was perhaps the most dangerous and effective of all the Nazi leaders after Hitler himself, adds another layer to this story. Heydrich was the chief of the Reich Security Main Office and the principal organizer of the Holocaust, chairing the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, at which the final solution was formally coordinated. He was also, by physical appearance, the closest thing the Nazi leadership had to the Nordic Aryan ideal: tall, blonde, blue-eyed, physically imposing, and athletic. Yet Heydrich himself was the subject of persistent rumours during his lifetime that he was of partial Jewish ancestry, a claim that his enemies within the Nazi movement used against him, and that reportedly caused him genuine personal anguish. The rumours centred on his family name and some genealogical ambiguities in his background. The historical verdict on whether these rumours had any factual basis is uncertain. The German genealogist who investigated the question after the war concluded that the Jewish ancestry claim was not supported by the available evidence, but the uncertainty was never fully resolved during Heydrich's lifetime. The Heydrich case is particularly striking because it illustrates how the Nazi obsession with racial purity created a kind of paranoid anxiety that affected even the most powerful figures of the regime. In a world where racial identity was the foundation of legal status, social position, and ultimately the right to exist, the question of ancestry became a weapon that could be used by anyone against anyone, including against the architects of the racial system themselves. The leaders of the Third Reich lived in a world they had created in which the most important question about any person was their racial origin, and in which the answer to that question was often genuinely uncertain. They had built a system premised on the existence of clear and rigid racial categories, and they found themselves enmeshed in a world where those categories dissolved on examination into ambiguity, uncertainty, and complexity. Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat who organized the logistics of the Holocaust, was another figure whose ancestry attracted attention. Eichmann spoke Hebrew and some Yiddish, and some of his Jewish victims reportedly refused to believe that this man who spoke their language could be the architect of their destruction. The explanation for Eichmann's language skills was mundane. He had grown up in a part of Austria with a significant Jewish population and had learned the languages through ordinary childhood exposure. But the rumors that circulated about his possible Jewish origins were another manifestation of the same dynamic. In a world organized around racial identity, the question of ancestry became simultaneously the most important and the most unstable element of a person's identity. Now we should look at the fascinating question of what happened to the DNA evidence and the scientific investigation after the initial 2010 study, because the story of how this evidence has been received, debated, and built upon in the years since tells us something important about how we as a society engage with uncomfortable historical truths. The Mulder's Vermeeren findings were published in a popular magazine rather than a scientific journal, which meant they bypassed the formal peer review process that academic research undergoes. This has led some scientists to treat the findings with a degree of caution that they might not have applied to a peer-reviewed study, even though the actual DNA analysis was performed by qualified geneticists. The absence of a formal scientific publication makes it difficult for other researchers to evaluate the methodology in detail, to check the haplogroup assignments against current databases, or to verify the genealogical connections between the DNA donors and Adolf Hitler himself. Several scientists have called for a more rigorous follow-up study, one that would collect DNA from verified relatives, analyze it using the full range of modern genomic techniques, rather than just Y chromosome haplogroup analysis, and publish the results in a peer-reviewed scientific forum where the methodology could be properly evaluated. Such a study would potentially provide a much richer picture of the ancestral landscape of Hitler's family, including information about autosomal DNA, which reflects contributions from all ancestral lines rather than just the paternal one, and mitochondrial DNA, which traces the maternal line in the same way that the Y chromosome traces the paternal line. The mitochondrial haplogroup found in Hitler's relatives could provide information about the ancient origins of his maternal lineage, adding another dimension to the picture. To date, no such comprehensive follow-up study has been published, though it is possible that private research has been conducted and not made public. One particularly tantalizing possibility that has been discussed is whether DNA could ever be extracted directly from Adolf Hitler's remains, if any authentic biological material from him still exists. Hitler's body was burned in the garden of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin in the final days of April 1945, following his suicide on April 30th. The Soviet forces who captured Berlin subsequently excavated the area and found charred remains that they identified as Hitler and Eva Braun. These remains were moved to Soviet-controlled territory and kept secret for decades. For many years, a portion of skull bone was held in the Russian State Archive in Moscow and was displayed publicly as evidence that Hitler had indeed died in Berlin, rather than escaping. However, in 2018, a French forensic team was allowed to examine the skull fragment, and their analysis concluded that the skull belonged to a woman between the ages of 30 and 40, not to Adolf Hitler, raising questions about the authenticity of that particular specimen. Other biological material attributed to Hitler, including a section of jaw and teeth held by the Russians, has not been subjected to full modern DNA analysis as far as the public record shows. The teeth held by the Russians are potentially the most promising source of authentic Hitler DNA, since teeth can preserve DNA very well over long periods, particularly in the root canals where cellular material is protected from degradation. If a full genomic analysis of these teeth were performed, it could potentially settle once and for all the question of Hitler's Y chromosome haplogroup and provide much richer information about his complete ancestral background. Whether such an analysis will ever be conducted depends on decisions by Russian authorities about access to the material and on the broader political context of international scientific cooperation with Russia, which has become more complicated in recent years. The possibility remains open, and some researchers and journalists have called for exactly such an investigation. For now, however, the 2010 study of living relatives remains the most significant genetic investigation into Hitler's ancestry that has been conducted and published. Let us now consider what all of this means for our understanding of Adolf Hitler as a historical figure and of the ideology he created and embodied. The DNA findings do not change any of the fundamental historical facts about what Hitler did. The Holocaust happened. 6 million Jews were murdered, millions of others were killed or enslaved. The Second World War, in which 50 to 80 million people died, was primarily the product of Nazi Germany's aggression. These facts are not affected by what Hitler's Y chromosome happened to look like, but the ancestry findings do contribute something important to our understanding of Hitler's psychology, of the nature of Nazi ideology, and of the broader question of how racial categories function in human societies. They show us, in the most concrete possible terms, that the categories Hitler used to justify genocide were not descriptions of biological reality, but were social and political constructions imposed on a much more complex and fluid genetic reality. The man who made racial purity the foundation of state policy apparently could not have met the standards of racial purity that his own state imposed on its citizens. The irony is not merely interesting or entertaining in a dark way, it is morally and philosophically significant because it demonstrates the fundamental hollowness of the ideology at the most intimate and personal level. There is also something important to be said about what the response of Hitler's living relatives tells us. The Stuart-Houston brothers in Long Island, with their quiet pact not to have children, are responding to their inherited identity in a way that is both deeply understandable and deeply poignant. They did not choose to be related to Adolf Hitler. They bear no responsibility for his crimes. The accident of their birth placed upon them a burden that most people cannot imagine, and the choice they have made to bear that burden and allow the bloodline to end with them is a kind of moral statement that deserves acknowledgement. They are not the only family members of perpetrators who have had to grapple with these questions. The children and grandchildren of many Holocaust perpetrators have written and spoken about the experience of growing up under the shadow of their relatives' crimes, and their accounts reveal a range of responses from denial and defensiveness to grief, shame, and active commitment to education and remembrance. The most remarkable of these stories, in the context of our discussion of Hitler's ancestry and DNA, is arguably the account of Benjamin Wilkomirski, though Wilkomirski's case ultimately turned out to be a fabrication rather than a genuine memoir. More genuinely relevant are the accounts of figures like Bernhard Frank, son of the Nazi Minister of Justice Franz Gürtner, or the children of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. Rudolf Höss was executed in 1947, hanged at the very concentration camp he had commanded, and his family had to live with the knowledge of what he had done. His son, Hans Höss, has spoken publicly about the experience, describing the gradual and devastating realization of what his father's work had actually entailed, and the lifelong burden of processing that knowledge. These family stories, including the story of Hitler's American relatives, form a human thread running through the vast and terrible tapestry of Holocaust history, and they remind us that the consequences of what happened between 1933 and 1945 continue to ripple outward through time in ways that touch lives that were not even born when the crimes were committed. The genetic story of Hitler's ancestry is, in a sense, a thread in this same tapestry. It connects the deeply personal, the question of one man's biological origins and genetic identity, to the vast and terrible historical forces that he unleashed. It demonstrates that even at the most intimate biological level, the categories Hitler used to define humanity were false. It shows us that the ancient human migrations and genetic exchanges that produced every person alive today do not respect the racial boundaries that ideologies attempt to impose on them. And it reminds us, through the extraordinarily powerful medium of DNA, of something that philosophy and ethics have long understood, but that the nightmare of the 20th century seemed at times to obscure, that we are, all of us, members of a single human family, related to one another in ways that no racial ideology can fully sever or deny. Let us now expand our exploration to look at the broader question of what the study of Hitler's ancestry, both genetic and genealogical, has meant for the field of historical research and for our collective understanding of the Nazi period. When the 2010 DNA study was published, it generated an enormous amount of media coverage, and most of that coverage focused on the irony of the findings. Hitler, the man who hated Jews and Africans, apparently had a Y chromosome associated with those very populations. The irony was real, and reporting on it was legitimate. But the more profound significance of the findings, which was somewhat lost in the rush to report the headline, lay in what they demonstrated about the relationship between genetic science and the racial ideologies that have caused so much human suffering. Let us explore that more profound significance in some depth, because it is ultimately what makes this story more than just a historical curiosity. Modern genetics has, over the past 3 decades, demolished the scientific foundations of racial theory more thoroughly than any previous intellectual movement had managed to do. Earlier anti-racist scholarship, going back to the work of Franz Boas and others in the early 20th century, had argued on anthropological and sociological grounds that racial categories were primarily social constructions rather than biological realities. But genetics has gone further, demonstrating at the molecular level that the genetic variation within what we call races is typically greater than the genetic variation between them, that the concept of biological race lacks scientific validity, and that human genetic diversity is distributed in complex overlapping patterns that cannot be reduced to a small number of discrete categories. The findings about Hitler's Y chromosome are a particularly vivid illustration of this general truth. Here is a case where one of history's most committed racial ideologists apparently possessed a genetic marker that, by the standards of any objective population genetic analysis, would place him closer to the populations he persecuted than to the ones he idealized. If racial categories were biologically real and meaningful, this should not be possible. The fact that it is entirely possible, and apparently the case, demonstrates precisely the arbitrariness and scientific bankruptcy of those categories. But there is another layer to the story that takes us beyond the simple irony of the findings into more philosophically interesting territory. Even if the DNA findings had shown that Hitler's Y chromosome was the most stereotypically Northern European haplogroup imaginable, the most quintessentially Germanic R1b or I1 that could be found, this would not have validated his ideology or made his racial theories any more scientifically credible. The meaninglessness of racial categories as biological realities does not depend on any particular individual's genetic profile. It is a general truth about the nature of human genetic variation, one that is not altered by the specific haplogroup of any one person, however historically significant. The reason the Hitler findings matter is not that they somehow disprove Nazi racial theory by showing that its own author was impure by his own standards, as if racial theory would have been valid if only Hitler had had the right haplogroup. They matter because they provide a particularly concrete and dramatic illustration of the general scientific truth that racial categories are not meaningful biological divisions of the human species. This is an important distinction to make because the narrative of Hitler was actually Jewish or African. How ironic can, if not handled carefully, inadvertently reinforce the very categories it is meant to undermine. If we treat the discovery of non-European haplogroups in Hitler's relatives as primarily significant because it is ironic that Hitler had Jewish DNA or African DNA, we are implicitly treating those categories as meaningful, as if there really were such a thing as Jewish DNA or African DNA in the essentialist sense that Nazi ideology assumed. The more scientifically accurate and philosophically coherent way to frame the findings is to say that they demonstrate once again at the level of one historically significant individual that human beings cannot be cleanly sorted into racial categories based on their genetic makeup, and that the genetic heritage of any individual is the product of an ancient and complex web of migration and mixing that defies the simple racial taxonomies that ideologies have attempted to impose on human diversity. With this more nuanced framing in mind, let us return to the specific historical questions about Hitler's ancestry and examine some of the other genealogical research that has been done on the family. One particularly interesting aspect of the research is what we know about the regional and cultural background of the Waldviertel area where Hitler's family originated, because this background helps explain some of the genetic patterns that might otherwise seem puzzling. The Waldviertel, which translates roughly as forest quarter, is a rural region of Lower Austria characterized by dense forests, poor agricultural soils, and a long history of relative economic backwardness compared to the more prosperous parts of the Habsburg Empire. The population has historically been predominantly Catholic, German-speaking, and engaged in small-scale farming and forestry. The region borders Bohemia to the north, and there has been significant cultural and genetic exchange with Czech-speaking populations across this border over the centuries. The villages where the Schicklgruber, Pölzl, and Hitler families lived were small, isolated communities where the same surnames appear repeatedly across the generations, suggesting a relatively closed genetic pool in which intermarriage within the local community was common. This regional genetic background is relevant to the Hitler haplogroup findings, because it means that whatever E1b1b lineage existed in Hitler's paternal family was almost certainly present in the Waldviertel community for multiple generations, rather than being the product of any very recent migration or intermarriage with a non-European population. The E1b1b haplogroup in his relatives was not introduced into the family line last week or last century in any obvious historical sense. It has been there for generations, invisible in a community that had no genetic testing and no reason to think about its members' deep ancestral origins. The question of how that haplogroup got into the Central European gene pool at all is a question about ancient human migrations, not about any recent specific ethnic or religious identity. The most likely pathway for E1b1b to have reached rural Austria is through one of the ancient migration events that genetic researchers have documented in detail. As we have discussed, the Neolithic farming expansion from Anatolia, which began roughly 8,000 years ago, is one major route through which E1b1b entered Europe. These ancient farmers moved northwestward from the Balkans through Central Europe, intermarrying with the existing hunter-gatherer populations and gradually spreading their agricultural way of life across the continent. As they spread, they brought their Y chromosome haplogroups with them, including E1b1b. In the regions of Central Europe that they colonized, including what is now Austria, their genetic descendants have remained part of the population ever since. Their ancient Anatolian Y chromosomes hidden among generations of German-speaking Catholic peasants who had no idea their paternal lineage stretched back to farming communities in the ancient Near East. This is the deep history that the DNA findings illuminate. When Jean-Paul Mulders found E1b1b in the relatives of Adolf Hitler, he was not finding evidence of a recent Jewish grandfather or a North African adventurer who had passed through the Waldviertel and fathered a child. He was finding evidence of a lineage that stretched back through the millennia to the ancient movements of human populations that shaped the genetic landscape of Europe long before any of the ethnic or religious categories that Hitler made his obsession had come into existence. The irony of a committed racial ideologist carrying a haplogroup associated with Jewish and North African populations is real and significant. But the even deeper irony is this. The haplogroup was in his family long before concepts like Jewish or North African had any meaning in the form they took in the 20th century. His racial ideology was not just factually wrong about his own genetics, it was anachronistically wrong, imposing modern racial categories onto a prehistoric past in which no such categories existed. Let us now look at another fascinating thread in this story. The question of how the findings about Hitler's ancestry fit into the broader landscape of genetic research on historical figures. DNA analysis of historical individuals is a growing field, and Hitler is far from the only historical figure whose genetics have been investigated. The study of ancient DNA has allowed researchers to analyze the genomes of individuals ranging from Neanderthals to Egyptian pharaohs to medieval plague victims, providing extraordinary insights into human history and migration. More recently, researchers have used genetic techniques to investigate the ancestry of various modern historical figures, including royalty, politicians, and other public figures whose family histories are of interest to the public and to scholars. The technical challenges of obtaining and analyzing DNA from historical individuals are significant, particularly when the individual in question died decades or centuries ago and left no clear biological samples. But advances in ancient DNA methodology have made it possible to work with increasingly degraded samples, opening up possibilities that would have been unimaginable even 20 years ago. In Hitler's case, as we have discussed, the primary obstacle is the lack of confirmed biological material directly from Hitler himself. The dental remains held in Russia represent the most promising potential source, and there has been persistent interest among researchers in obtaining access to these materials for genetic analysis. Russian authorities have been reluctant to provide such access, and the political complications of the Russia-Ukraine conflict since 2022 have made international scientific cooperation with Russia even more difficult. Whether the question of Hitler's direct genetic analysis will ever be resolved remains uncertain. But even if it is, the basic picture revealed by the study of his relatives is unlikely to change dramatically. The Y chromosome haplogroup identified in those relatives reflects the deep paternal ancestry of the family, and unless some future analysis reveals an unexpected non-paternity event that changes the picture, the E1b1b finding is likely to remain the best available genetic evidence about Hitler's ancestral background. What might a full genomic analysis of Hitler's DNA reveal if it were ever possible? Geneticists have speculated about this question in various contexts. A complete genome would reveal not just the Y chromosome haplogroup, but the full autosomal DNA, which reflects contributions from all ancestral lines, and would provide a rich picture of the mixed ancestry that shaped his biological heritage. It would also reveal the mitochondrial DNA, tracing his maternal line, and might potentially identify specific genetic variants associated with various traits and disease predispositions. It would not, of course, reveal anything about his personality, his psychology, his ideology, or his choices, which are products of culture, experience, and individual agency, rather than genetics. But it would potentially resolve some of the genealogical uncertainties about his family background and add to the broader scientific picture of Central European genetic diversity in the early 20th century. It might also reveal some of the specific genetic characteristics of the Waldviertel population, contributing to the growing scientific literature on European regional genetic diversity. There is one more dimension of the Hitler ancestry story that we have not yet fully explored, and it is perhaps the most psychologically compelling of all: the question of what Hitler himself may have known or suspected about his own ancestry. We know from Hans Frank's account that Hitler was sufficiently worried about the question to commission an investigation. We know from various biographical sources that he was acutely sensitive to any suggestions about Jewish blood in his family line, reacting with fury and legal action to such allegations. We know that the regime took steps, including the destruction of the village of Dullersheim, that could be interpreted as attempts to suppress potentially embarrassing genealogical records. But what did Hitler actually believe about his own origins? Did he have specific knowledge or specific fears that drove his reaction to these questions? Or was his sensitivity simply the product of the political vulnerability that any uncertainty about his ancestry created in the context of the ideology he was promoting? The psychological literature on Hitler is vast and varied, ranging from sober academic biography to speculative psychoanalytic interpretation. The most credible accounts suggest that Hitler's relationship to his own ancestry was complex and anxious. He reportedly rarely spoke about his family background except in carefully controlled contexts, and he actively discouraged any detailed public investigation of his family history. His treatment of his own relatives was complicated. His niece Geli Raubal, who lived with him in Munich and with whom he appears to have had an intensely possessive and possibly sexual relationship, died under mysterious circumstances in 1931, and the exact nature of their relationship has been the subject of extensive speculation. His half-nephew, William Patrick Hitler, as we have discussed, was regarded with a mixture of contempt and fear. His surviving relatives in Austria were reportedly regarded as potential embarrassments rather than sources of pride or connection. What does all this tell us about Hitler's inner life? The honest answer is that we cannot know with any certainty what Hitler believed or feared about his own ancestry. The historical evidence allows us to observe his behavior, to note the inconsistencies and anxieties that his handling of the ancestry question suggests, and to speculate about their sources. But The inner world of Adolf Hitler, including any private beliefs or fears he may have had about his own racial identity, remains beyond our reach. What we can say is that the pattern of behavior suggests a man who was not entirely comfortable with the uncertainty surrounding his family background and who took active steps to manage and suppress inquiry into it. Whether this discomfort reflected actual knowledge of non-Aryan ancestry, a fear of what investigation might reveal, or simply a politician's caution about any potential vulnerability, we cannot definitively say. Let us return now to the scientific evidence and consider what the totality of the genetic and genealogical research tells us about Hitler's ancestry. When we survey all of the available information, a picture emerges that is complex, layered, and in many ways deeply ironic. On the paternal side, the genetic evidence from living relatives points to a Y chromosome haplogroup, E1b1b, that is rare in Central Europe, but more common in North Africa, the Middle East, and among Jewish diaspora populations. The genealogical records confirm that Hitler's paternal grandmother, Maria Schicklgruber, had an illegitimate child whose father has never been definitively identified. The man who officially acknowledged paternity, Johann Georg Hitler, did so posthumously under suspicious circumstances, and some historians believe the actual father may have been Johann Nepomuk Hitler or someone else entirely unknown. On the maternal side, Hitler's family was rooted in the same small network of Waldviertel peasant families as his paternal family, with his parents being related as second cousins through Johann Nepomuk Hitler. The consanguinity in his family background may have had health consequences for his siblings, 4 of whom died in infancy. The specific claim of Jewish ancestry through a Graz family named Frankenberger, advanced by Hans Frank in his post-war memoirs, has been thoroughly debunked by subsequent historical research. No such family existed in Graz at the relevant time, and the historical records simply do not support Frank's account. But the debunking of Frank's specific claim does not resolve the fundamental question of who fathered Alois Schicklgruber, and it does not contradict the genetic finding of an unusual Y chromosome haplogroup in Hitler's relatives. These two threads of evidence, the genealogical uncertainty about Alois's father and the genetic evidence of an unusual paternal haplogroup, are consistent with each other and together paint a picture of a family background that is more complex and ambiguous than Nazi ideology would have found comfortable. The broader historical significance of all this research goes beyond mere biographical curiosity about a long-dead historical figure. It speaks to fundamental questions about the nature of identity, the scientific validity of racial categories, the relationship between genetics and ideology, and the moral consequences of building political systems on false racial premises. These questions are not merely historical, they remain urgently relevant today in a world where genetic ancestry testing has become a consumer product available to anyone with $100 and a saliva sample, where debates about race and genetics continue to shape public policy and social relations, and where various forms of racial nationalism are once again finding political expression in many countries. The lessons of the Hitler ancestry story are therefore not merely lessons about one man's family history. They are lessons about the fundamental unreliability and moral danger of racial categorization, lessons written in the DNA of history's most notorious racial ideologist. Consider for a moment the extraordinary arc of this story. In the 19th century, a woman named Maria Schicklgruber gave birth to an illegitimate child in a remote corner of rural Austria, and the identity of that child's father was never officially established. In the first decades of the 20th century, that child's son built a movement premised on the absolute importance of racial ancestry and the irredeemable inferiority of people, whose ancestry differed from an imagined Aryan ideal. That man launched the most destructive war in human history and perpetrated the most systematic genocide of the modern era, all in the name of racial purity. And then, a century and a half after the mystery of Maria Schicklgruber's lover was first recorded, modern science peered into the DNA of the murderer's living relatives and found a genetic signature associated with the very people he had tried to destroy. If the universe has a sense of irony, it has rarely expressed it more completely. Now let us look at some of the specific individuals who have contributed to the investigation of Hitler's ancestry over the years, because this is also a story about the researchers, journalists, and scholars who have worked to uncover the truth, and their stories are worth telling. Jean-Paul Mulders, the Belgian journalist who conducted the 2010 DNA study, spent years working on the investigation before the results were published. He tracked down Hitler's relatives in the United States and Austria, approached them for DNA samples, and navigated the complex ethical and legal landscape of conducting genetic research on private individuals without institutional backing. His account of the investigation, published in NAC and subsequently in a book, reveals the extraordinary lengths to which he went to obtain the samples and the mixed reactions he received from the relatives he approached. Some were cooperative, others wary, and some actively hostile to the investigation. The fact that the American relatives, the descendants of William Patrick Hitler, agreed to provide samples at all suggests that they were willing to engage with the question of their ancestry even in this unconventional scientific context, perhaps as part of their own ongoing effort to understand and come to terms with who they are descended from. Mark Vermeeren, the historian who collaborated with Mulders, brought scholarly rigour to the genealogical dimensions of the investigation, tracing the family connections that identified the DNA donors as genuine relatives of Adolf Hitler. His work on the Hitler family tree drew on decades of previous genealogical research by historians, including Werner Maaser, Brigitte Hamann, and others, building on a rich tradition of scholarship about one of history's most heavily scrutinised family histories. Vermeeren's contribution was to connect the new genetic tools with the existing genealogical record in a way that made the DNA findings meaningful and interpretable. Without the careful genealogical work establishing who the DNA donors were related to and how, the haplogroup findings would have been interesting but unconnectable to the specific historical question of Hitler's ancestry. The geneticist Ronnie Decourt, who performed the actual DNA analysis, was perhaps in the most delicate position of all. As a scientist, he was trained to interpret genetic data objectively and to express its implications in appropriately qualified terms. But the data he was analyzing carried an enormous cultural and historical weight that no routine genetic analysis has to bear. His statements about the findings were carefully calibrated to distinguish between what the science could and could not demonstrate. He confirmed the haplogroup identification and its population-level associations, but he was careful not to make specific claims about Hitler's ethnic identity that the data could not support. This scientific caution was appropriate and important, even if the popular media coverage of the findings sometimes exceeded what the science actually justified. What would it mean for our understanding of Hitler if future research conclusively established that he did have verifiable Jewish or North African ancestry in his recent family history? This is a question worth exploring, even though the historical evidence for any such specific ancestry claim is weak at best. If it were definitively demonstrated that, say, Maria Schicklgruber had indeed had an affair with a Jewish man in the 1830s, making Hitler's paternal grandfather Jewish, and if this were confirmed by both documentary and genetic evidence, the implications would be extraordinary. It would not change any of the historical facts about the Holocaust or Hitler's role in it. It would not make his victims any more or less dead, or their suffering any more or less real. But it would add a psychological and biographical dimension to the story that would demand serious historical reckoning. How would we understand a man who murdered millions of people based on a racial identity that he may have shared? Would it change our understanding of the Holocaust to know that its architect may have been destroying part of his own heritage? The answers to these questions are not simple, and they have been debated by scholars who have grappled with the psychological dimensions of Hitler's anti-Semitism. The historian John Lukács, writing about Hitler's relationship to Jews and Judaism, noted that Hitler's obsession with Jews went far beyond what could be explained by simple political calculation or even cultural anti-Semitism. There was something almost personal about it, a ferocity that some analysts have attributed to deep psychological conflicts that may or may not have been related to anxieties about his own identity. Whether those conflicts were connected to any real or imagined Jewish ancestry cannot be determined from the available evidence, but the question remains alive in the scholarly literature as one of the unresolved dimensions of Hitler's psychology. Let us now spend some time looking at the way in which the Hitler ancestry story has been reflected in popular culture and media, because the public understanding of this story has been shaped as much by journalism, documentary filmmaking, and popular writing as by academic scholarship, and the popular treatment has not always been as nuanced as the academic treatment. Since the 2010 DNA study, the story of Hitler's haplogroup has been covered in dozens of documentary films, thousands of news articles, and numerous books aimed at general audiences. The coverage has ranged from sober and careful to sensationalized and misleading. Some documentaries have presented the findings as definitively proving that Hitler was part Jewish or part African, going well beyond what the scientific evidence actually demonstrates. Others have treated the findings with appropriate caution, presenting them as suggestive and interesting but not conclusive. The best treatments have used the findings as a starting point for a broader exploration of what racial categories mean, where they come from, and why they are scientifically and morally problematic. One area where the popular coverage has been particularly variable is in the treatment of the E1b1b haplogroup's association with Jewish populations. Media reports have sometimes described the haplogroup as Jewish DNA, a phrase that geneticists find deeply problematic. There is no single haplogroup that defines Jewish ancestry, because Jewish populations are themselves genetically diverse, reflecting the diverse geographic origins of the various diaspora communities. Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Ethiopian Jews, and other Jewish communities each have distinct genetic profiles reflecting their particular historical and geographic trajectories. E1b1b is indeed found at elevated frequencies in some Jewish populations, but it is also found in many non-Jewish populations, and the presence of E1b1b in a person's genetic profile does not indicate Jewish ancestry in any simple or direct sense. The careless use of phrases like Jewish DNA in media coverage of the Hitler story is itself a form of the essentialism that the scientific findings are supposed to undermine. A more carefully considered discussion would note that E1b1b is a haplogroup with ancient Middle, Eastern and North African origins, that it is found across a range of modern populations, including but not limited to certain Jewish communities, and that its presence in Hitler's relatives tells us about the ancient geographic origins of one ancestral line, rather than about any specific modern ethnic or religious identity. This is a more accurate but admittedly less headline-friendly way of presenting the findings. The gap between scientific accuracy and popular accessibility in reporting about genetics is a persistent challenge, and the Hitler ancestry story illustrates it particularly clearly because the subject matter carries such enormous emotional and political charge. Let us conclude this section of our exploration by looking at the specific question of what the ancestry findings mean for the memory and legacy of the Holocaust. The Holocaust is, among other things, the most extreme possible demonstration of the consequences of taking racial ideology seriously as a basis for state policy. The murder of 6 million Jews was predicated on the assumption that Jews were a distinct biological group, with characteristics that made them dangerous and inferior, and that those characteristics were determined by hereditary transmission from generation to generation. Modern genetics has demolished that premise absolutely. Jews are not a distinct biological population in any simple genetic sense. They share vast amounts of their genetic heritage with the non-Jewish populations among whom they lived, and the genetic markers that can sometimes be identified in certain Jewish populations reflect particular historical patterns of endogamy and migration, rather than any biologically significant distinction from other human beings. The Nazis murdered 6 million people, based on a premise that was scientifically false. The Hitler ancestry findings add a specific and particularly poignant illustration to this general truth. The man who organized the murder of 6 million people based on a false theory of racial difference apparently carried in his own genome genetic markers that connected him to the populations he was destroying. This is not merely ironic. It is a demonstration at the most intimate personal level of the falsity of the ideology that drove the genocide. If racial categories were real and meaningful, the Führer's own DNA would have confirmed his Aryan identity. Instead, it pointed toward a different and more complex ancestral story, one that does not fit neatly into the racial categories he spent his life promoting. The Holocaust happened because people accepted racial ideology as truth. The genetics of Adolf Hitler himself demonstrate that this ideology was a lie at every level, from the broadest scientific claims about race as a biological reality to the most personal question of the Führer's own genetic heritage. This is why the story of what DNA revealed about Adolf Hitler's ancestry matters, not merely as a historical curiosity or a satisfying irony, but as a profound illustration of a fundamental truth, that the categories we use to divide and classify human beings are almost always more arbitrary, more constructed, and less scientifically grounded than the ideologies built upon them proclaim. The history of racial ideology, from scientific racism in the 19th century through Nazism in the 20th century and its contemporary echoes in the 21st, is a history of the terrible consequences of taking those arbitrary categories as absolute truths and building systems of power, privilege, and persecution upon them. The DNA of Adolf Hitler's relatives is, in its way, a small scientific monument to the falseness of that enterprise, a molecular testament to the truth that human beings cannot be sorted into the kinds of rigid categories that hate requires, and that the deepest genetic heritage of even the most committed racial ideologist refuses to be confined within the racial borders he tried to draw. There is one more major dimension of this story that we have not yet fully addressed, what the Ancestry revelations mean in the context of ongoing debates about the relationship between genetics and social identity in the modern world. We live in an era when consumer genetic testing has made ancestral DNA analysis available to tens of millions of people, when the science of population genetics is advancing at extraordinary speed, and when questions about race, ancestry and identity are being contested with renewed intensity in political and social life. The Hitler ancestry story, precisely because it involves such an extreme and historically significant case, offers a kind of stress test for how we think about genetic ancestry and its relationship to personal and social identity. Consider what it would mean to apply the logic of the Nazi racial laws to Adolf Hitler himself, using the DNA evidence. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 defined a Jew as anyone with at least 3 Jewish grandparents, or 2 Jewish grandparents if the person was married to a Jew or was a member of the Jewish religious community. A person with 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents was classified as a Mischling, a person of mixed racial heritage, subject to various restrictions, but not to the full force of the laws directed at Jews. The question of whether any of Hitler's grandparents were Jewish cannot be resolved on the basis of the available evidence, as we have discussed. But the mere existence of an unusual Y chromosome haplogroup in his paternal line raises the theoretical question. Under the racial laws he created, would Hitler himself have been required to prove that his grandfather was not Jewish? The irony is almost too perfect. The man who created the bureaucratic machinery for classifying millions of people by their ancestry apparently had a family background that was precisely the kind of ancestry question that machinery was designed to investigate. The specific paradox extends even further when we consider the SS racial requirements, which were even more stringent than the Nuremberg laws. Himmler's elite force required its members to demonstrate pure Aryan ancestry, going back to 1750. Given the genealogical gaps and uncertainties in Hitler's family history, particularly the unknown identity of his paternal grandfather, a rigorous application of SS genealogical standards to the Führer would have been impossible to satisfy. The man who commanded the SS could not have proven to the SS's own standards of racial purity that he was qualified to be a member. This is not a minor footnote. It is a fundamental indictment of the entire system. A bureaucracy of racial classification that cannot classify its own creator is a bureaucracy built on fantasy, and the fantasy always was and always will be exactly that. The story of Hitler's ancestry also raises fascinating questions about the mechanics of historical memory and how communities preserve or suppress difficult truths about the past. The Waldviertel region of Austria, where Hitler's family originated, has had a complex relationship with that heritage over the decades since the war. The region is not defined by its connection to Hitler. It is a working agricultural and touristic area with its own history, culture, and identity that extends far beyond the accident of one family's origin there. Local communities have generally preferred to minimize rather than commemorate their connection to the man, and the destruction of the village of Döllersheim, whatever its original motivation, has left a permanent gap in the historical record of the region. The artillery range that replaced the village is still in active military use today, and the site of Maria Schicklgruber's grave is inaccessible to the public. There is something symbolically appropriate about this. The very origins of Hitler's family history have been physically obliterated, existing now only in the genetic record of dispersed relatives and in the archival reconstructions of historians and genealogists. Let us now examine the question of how the ancestry investigations connect to the broader historiographical debates about the nature of Nazism and of Hitler himself. The two main competing interpretations of Hitler that have dominated historical debate since the war are the intentionalist view, which holds that Hitler had a premeditated plan for genocide that he pursued consistently from early in his career, and the functionalist or structuralist view, which emphasizes the improvisational and bureaucratic dynamics of the Nazi system, rather than Hitler's individual intentions as the primary driver of the Holocaust. The ancestry question connects more directly to the intentionalist interpretation, because the theory that Hitler's anti-Semitism was partly driven by anxieties about his own origins is fundamentally a claim about his individual psychology and intentions. But even for functionalist historians who emphasize structural factors over individual psychology, the ancestry findings have some relevance because they illustrate the broader irrationality of the racial classification system that the Nazi state built, a system so irrational that it could not consistently classify even its own creator. The debate about Hitler's psychology and motivation is ultimately a debate about how individuals and systems interact to produce historical outcomes, and the ancestry question sits at the intersection of these levels. Whatever Hitler's private psychological state regarding his own origins, the racial ideology he promoted and the system he created operated according to a logic that was independent of any one individual's personal psychology. The Holocaust was not simply the product of one man's madness, however significant Hitler's role was in initiating and driving it. It was the product of a system that mobilized millions of ordinary people in the service of a dehumanizing ideology, a system that created bureaucratic incentives for persecution and murder that operated even in the absence of direct orders from the top. In this sense, the ancestry findings are a comment not just on Hitler but on the system he created, a system so divorced from biological reality that its founding mythology collapsed under the scrutiny of the very science that the 20th century produced. One particularly striking aspect of the ancestry story is the way it connects to the question of Nazi racial ideology's relationship to actual German and Austrian identity. The Nazis built their ideology around a mythologized version of German and Germanic identity that had little to do with the actual historical diversity of the German-speaking world. Real German and Austrian communities had always been the product of historical mixing and migration, including Slavic influences in the east and south, Romance influences in the west and south, and various other contributions from the long history of human movement through Central Europe. The Waldviertel, where Hitler's family came from, was not some pristine repository of Germanic racial purity. It was a community on a cultural border, influenced by Czech and Slavic neighbours, shaped by centuries of historical contingency, and, as the DNA evidence suggests, carrying genetic signatures in its gene pool that traced back to ancient migrations from outside the narrow confines of the Germanic heartland. The construction of a racial ideology that defined real Germans by a mythologized biological standard that most actual Germans could not meet was always going to produce paradoxes and contradictions. The Hitler ancestry paradox is simply the most extreme version of a contradiction that was embedded in the ideology from the beginning. A regime that required its citizens to prove their racial purity to several generations back, that classified and persecuted its own population based on the most intimate details of their family histories, was a regime that had decided to build the state on a scientific fiction. And the consequences of building a state on a scientific fiction, as the 20th century demonstrated with devastating clarity, can be catastrophic on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. Let us now turn to one final dimension of the ancestry story that we have not yet explored: the question of what the findings mean for religious and theological reflection on the Holocaust. The Holocaust has been the subject of extensive theological reflection by Jewish, Christian, and other religious thinkers over the decades since the war, and many of these reflections have grappled with questions of identity, ancestry, and the meaning of persecution based on inherited characteristics. The finding that Hitler's own genetic heritage was partly connected to the populations he persecuted adds a specific and troubling dimension to these reflections. For Jewish theologians and communities, the Holocaust represents a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale, one that raises profound questions about the nature of evil, the meaning of chosenness, and the relationship between Jewish identity and suffering. The Ancestry findings do not change any of these fundamental questions, but they add to the picture of the particular irony and injustice of the Nazi project. A project that destroyed millions of people based on inherited identity, undertaken by a man who may himself have shared some portion of that inherited identity. For Christian communities, which bear a complex and painful historical responsibility for the centuries of anti-Semitism that created the cultural soil in which Nazism flourished, the Ancestry findings add another layer to the already heavy burden of reflection. The Catholic Church in particular has engaged in decades of self-examination about its role in European anti-Semitism and its failure to more forcefully oppose the Holocaust. The fact that Hitler was raised in a nominally Catholic environment, that the village church registers in the Waldviertel recorded his family's baptisms and confirmations, that the dispensation for his parents' consanguineous marriage was granted by church authorities, are all threads in the complex historical tapestry of the relationship between Christian culture and Nazi ideology. The Ancestry findings do not simplify this picture, but they add to it the reminder that the racial categories Nazism used were constructions that even the biological reality of its own leadership contradicted. We should also spend some time looking at what contemporary genetic scientists and population geneticists make of the Hitler ancestry story when they encounter it today, because the scientific field has advanced significantly since 2010. And a modern geneticist's perspective on the findings may differ somewhat from the interpretations that were current when the study was first published. The field of population genetics has been transformed by the ancient DNA revolution, by the development of massive genomic databases containing millions of samples from populations around the world, and by the refinement of analytical techniques that can extract increasingly precise information from genetic data. In this context, the 2010 study, which relied on relatively standard Y chromosome haplogroup analysis of a modest number of samples from living relatives, appears somewhat limited by current standards. A modern genetic investigation of Hitler's ancestry would potentially use much more sophisticated techniques, analyzing thousands of genetic variants across the entire genome rather than just the Y chromosome, and comparing the results against vastly larger and more detailed reference databases. What might such an investigation reveal? It would almost certainly confirm the Y chromosome haplogroup finding, since that particular result is based on genetic markers that are reliably detectable and robustly associated with specific population groups. It would additionally provide information about the autosomal DNA, which reflects the complete mix of ancestral contributions from all lines, and which would give a much more complete picture of the population-level affinities of the family's genetic heritage. Based on what we know about the general genetic makeup of Central European populations and about the specific geographic and cultural background of the Waldviertel, we would expect the autosomal DNA to show primarily Central European ancestry, reflecting the broad mix of Paleolithic, Neolithic, and Bronze Age steppe contributions that characterizes the genetics of most modern Europeans. The unusual paternal haplogroup would remain as a distinctive marker within this broader Central European profile, a thread of more ancient and geographically diverse ancestry woven into an otherwise predominantly European genetic tapestry. The mitochondrial DNA, which traces the maternal line, would trace the ancestry of Hitler's mother, Clara Pölzl, and through her, the female line ancestry of the Pölzl family in the Waldviertel. Mitochondrial haplogroup analysis would provide another data point about the deep ancestry of one additional line in the family, adding to the overall picture. Given the geographic origins of the family, the mitochondrial haplogroup is likely to fall within one of the common European categories, such as H, which is the most common mitochondrial haplogroup in Europe and represents the dominant female line ancestry of most Europeans. But it is impossible to say with certainty without actually performing the analysis. What all of this speculation about hypothetical future investigations underlines is the genuine and ongoing scientific interest in the Hitler ancestry question. The story is not closed. The genetic picture remains incomplete, and as technology advances and as political circumstances change, it is possible that new investigations will add significantly to what we currently know. The question of what Hitler's DNA can tell us about his ancestry and about the racial ideology he promoted is not a finished chapter in historical research. It is an open and ongoing conversation that connects genealogy, genetics, history, psychology, philosophy, and ethics in ways that are likely to continue generating new insights for years to come. Before we bring this extraordinary journey through the ancestry and genetics of Adolf Hitler to a close, let us take one more look at the overarching moral and historical significance of everything we have covered. We began with the question of what DNA revealed about Hitler's ancestry, and we have explored that question from many angles. The 2010 haplogroup study and its findings, the long-standing genealogical mystery of Alois Hitler's paternity, the Hans Frank confession and its debunking, the history of the Volviertel communities where Hitler's family originated, the connections between the genetic findings and the scientific demolition of racial theory, the stories of Hitler's living relatives and how they have coped with their inherited burden, the broader context of Nazi racial ideology and its fundamental scientific bankruptcy, and the philosophical and historical implications of all of this for our understanding of identity, race, and the dangers of ideological thinking. What emerges from this exploration is a picture of extraordinary complexity and profound irony. Adolf Hitler was a man who built the most murderous racial ideology in modern history on the premise that human beings could be sorted into biologically distinct groups of superior and inferior quality, and that the highest duty of the state was to protect and advance the superior group at the expense of all others. He created a system that killed millions based on this premise, and yet, at every level of examination, the premise collapses. The categories he used were scientifically unfounded. The racial purity he demanded could not be demonstrated even by his own family. The genetic heritage of his relatives points not toward the Nordic Aryan ideal he celebrated, but toward the ancient human migrations from Africa and the Middle East that produced, in their complex interactions over millennia, every person alive on Earth today, regardless of their skin color, language, religion, or ancestry. The E1b1b haplogroup in the DNA of Adolf Hitler's relatives is, in a sense, nature's own verdict on the ideology of racial purity. A molecular refutation written not in ink, but in the most fundamental language of biology. And there is something in this story that speaks to a deeper truth about the human condition. We are all, every one of us, the products of ancient migrations and mixing that we cannot fully trace and would not have predicted. The genetic heritage of any individual, no matter how certain they are of their ancestry or how committed to a particular racial or ethnic identity, carries, within it, the marks of journeys taken and encounters made tens of thousands of years ago by people who lived in a world so different from our own that it would be unrecognizable. The Palestinian and the Israeli share genetic ancestors. The German and the Jew are genetically close cousins by any meaningful biological standard. The African and the European carry in their genomes the common heritage of the oldest branch of the human family tree. We are not separate races, we are a single, extraordinarily interconnected family that has been spread across the globe by the restless movement of our ancestors over hundreds of thousands of years. The racial ideologies that have tried to deny this truth, that have tried to construct barriers of essential difference and superiority within the human family, have done so in defiance of biology and in service of power, and the consequences have been catastrophic. Adolf Hitler's DNA, or rather the DNA of his relatives that allows us to infer something about his genetic heritage, is a small but potent reminder of this larger truth. The man who tried to divide humanity into pure and impure, superior and inferior, was himself a product of the same ancient mixing and migration that has produced every human being who has ever lived. His genes did not know his ideology. They carried their ancient story regardless of the stories he told about racial purity and Aryan supremacy. And in doing so, they tell us something that no amount of racial ideology can suppress, that the human family is one, that our differences are real but small, and that the construction of absolute categories of racial identity has always been and will always be a lie in the service of power. This is the ultimate lesson of what DNA revealed about Adolf Hitler's ancestry. It is a lesson written not in any historian's prose or any philosopher's argument, but in the molecular language of life itself, in the chemical sequences that link us to our ancestors across time and space and remind us that we are all always more connected to one another than the hatreds of history have tried to make us believe. The haplogroup E1b1b, found in the relatives of the man who made racial hatred the policy of a state, stands as a permanent genetic monument to the futility and the evil of that hatred. And the story of how we discovered it stands as a reminder of the power of science to illuminate truth, even in the darkest corners of human history. Well, that is everything we have covered in our deep dive into what DNA revealed about Adolf Hitler's ancestry. From the mystery of Maria Schicklgruber and the unknown father of Alois Hitler, to the explosive claims of Hans Frank and their systematic debunking, to the 2010 DNA study that found haplogroup E1b1b in the relatives of the Führer himself, to the broader scientific context of population genetics and the demolition of racial theory, to the extraordinary stories of Hitler's living relatives and how they have carried the burden of his name, we have explored one of the most complex, ironic, and historically significant genealogical stories ever told. Thank you so much for staying with us through this remarkable journey. If you found this video informative and thought-provoking, please make sure to check out our other videos diving deep into the history of the Second World War and the extraordinary human stories it contains. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest content. See you in the next one.